I think we're ready to go. I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight to the Yilva Soccer Fine Arts Center, Bethany Lutheran College, to our November art show. I was trying to remember what month it was. That happens, I suppose. Our current artist is a local artist who works in what I would consider a new medium, which is digital painting. I don't have a long association with him, but he informed me that he was once in the Young Michelangelo art camp. So I'm claiming credit for everything on the walls. He graduated from Mankato State, or University of Minnesota Mankato, approximately 10 years ago. He has a BFA in graphic design as well as a BS in journalism communication. He is a freelance artist, and he's going to tell you more details on his own. Please welcome Derek Wehrwein.
Hello, can everyone hear me? This good? All right, well, thanks everyone for showing up tonight for this event. My name is Derek, and it's great to be with you all here tonight. Let me start with something you might not hear every day from an artist. It feels strange to me to have to talk about my own work. This is not a new issue. I remember critiques being a regular occurrence while taking art classes in college, and I frequently grappled with uncertainty in regard to how to explain or what to say about my art. This was especially true later in college when my main artistic interest was what could be termed caricature art and illustration. In other words, more commercial style work that was maybe a little different than what the normal student might be pursuing in studio art classes. So the very thought of me trying to fill 20 minutes, much less 40 minutes, talking about my own work sends shivers down my spine. The good news, I think I might be up to the task, so let's get started. Tonight, I'm going to attempt to give some explanation, or at least some context, to both my work specifically, and also to the topic of caricature more broadly. My plan is to first give an overview of what caricature means to me, and talk about what sorts of things inspired me growing up, and that got me on the path to where I am today. Then I'll touch very briefly on the history of caricature itself. Finally, I will delve into some of the more technical aspects of what I do, talk about some of my work over the last 7 years, and touch on a few of my experiences working as a freelance graphic designer and illustrator. While not all of my work is caricature, as you can see from the gallery here, I also do portraits and the commercial work. Much of my energy and passion in the last decade has been directed toward caricature. And so for the purposes of tonight, I will be focusing more on that aspect of my work. It's my hope that you will leave here tonight with a greater appreciation for the art of caricature and its ability to provide a glimpse into the human soul. So, what is caricature? According to one dictionary definition I looked up, caricature is a picture, description, or imitation of a person in which certain striking characteristics are exaggerated in order to create a comic or grotesque effect. Now, I think that's an adequate, if somewhat superficial, definition of caricature. More on that later. There's actually another definition of caricature I ran across years ago. I don't remember who said this, but it's always stuck with me. So, the best description I've ever heard of caricature is simply this: it's the art of making people look more like themselves than they already do. In other words, caricature is about drawing the essence of people. It's a process that involves first accurately capturing a person's likeness and personality, and then accurately exaggerating it. And the key word there in both parts of that process is accurately. Because if you fail to do either one accurately, then the finished product fails. It's for this reason that I consider learning caricature to be as difficult as learning to capably draw a lifelike portrait. As aspiring artists, we spend our youth practicing and training our hand to accurately draw what our eyes see. I know when I was young, I would draw portraits just directly from photographs, paper on pencil, or pencil on paper, I should say. My goal would be to make the finished drawing look as much like that photograph as possible. The emphasis when we're young is learning to record the truth before our eyes in as accurate and lifelike a fashion as possible. And that's the way it should be when we're learning how to draw. But learning caricature flips that process around. It forces you to essentially retrain your brain. You're no longer just perceiving the truth before your eyes and attempting to render that truth. Instead, you're perceiving the truth and then trying to figure out how to distort the truth, but in a way that is still truthful. It's a fascinating dichotomy. What does this mean practically speaking? The first thing a caricature artist does is analyze the features and characteristics and structure that form a face. You're basically looking for two things. One, features that stand out as being different from what would be considered a normal, perfectly symmetrical face. And two, the relationship between those individual features, whether they're forehead and eyes, eyes and nose and mouth, what have you. This relationship of features is the foundation of caricature. Let's quick run through a few examples here. So you probably all know who this guy is. This is Jay Leno, and he's got a very famous face, mostly due to the chin. And I stumbled across this photo, and I really like it because it's not often you see just a profile of Jay. And I think this is interesting because you get to see his face in just a light you don't often see it in. So besides the prominent chin, he has this kind of a Roman nose, he has bushy eyebrows, small eyes, a big mop of hair, and the mass or weight of his face is in the bottom half because he has kind of a short forehead. And so those are some of the features that stand out on his face. Next up, I'm using Anne Hathaway as an example here. I think the most striking thing here is actually the contrast of pale skin to dark hair. She also has a long, thin face, kind of a longer nose, big lips, and definitely big eyes. And her eyebrows and eyes are kind of slanted at angles that are a bit unusual. I've got one more example here. Lastly, this is Dwight Schrute from The Office, one of my favorite shows. And I think the outstanding feature here is more his stare and the intensity of his eyes. But he also has a big forehead, including this kind of strange bulge in the top half of the forehead that's a little unusual. He has a very short nose, he has these small pursed lips, and obviously he has the glasses and the strange hairdo. All right, so when observing a face, I start asking myself questions such as, where's the weight or mass in the face, the top half or the bottom half? What is large, small, wide, or narrow? What is the overall shape of a person's head? Are the eyes large or small, wide or narrow, far apart or close together? What kind of nose does a person have? What kind of ears does a person have? What is the relationship of the various individual features to each other? What features stand out and why do they stand out? Those are questions a caricature artist mentally asks and then gathers the answers to. After time, this becomes almost second nature, and you'll start to find yourself subconsciously analyzing every single face you ever run across in life. It's a blessing and a curse. There's another layer to this too, beyond the nuts and bolts I just covered. Making mental notes about the relationships between features is more of an exercise in cold-blooded fact-finding. But I like my work to connect with viewers on a more visceral, emotional level. That means I need to look deeper when examining my subject. So I also start asking myself questions that go something like this. What emotions are evident on a face? Does a face reflect hope or weariness? Does it reflect courage or fear? Does it reflect youthfulness or age? Does it reflect joy or stress or anger or sadness? How about arrogance or humility? What is a particular face trying to tell me? What is a particular expression trying to tell me? There are definite objective answers to questions about how far apart someone's eyes are set or how big or small their ears are. That's observable fact. But these later questions ultimately have subjective answers, yet they are equally as important to ask. Caricatures or portraits that are based only on relationships between features will ultimately feel mechanical and lifeless. The best caricatures and portraits effectively incorporate both the facts and emotions. This is what I refer to when I talk about capturing people's essence. So what prompted my fascination with faces and in particular caricature art? I'm going to take a brief stroll down memory lane here. There are actually three particular memories that stick out in my mind. The first is receiving a Sports Illustrated for Kids issue with a caricature of Michael Jordan on the cover. It actually took me a bit of work on Google, but I was able to find it. This turns out to have been the March 1996 issue of Sports Illustrated for Kids, meaning I would have been 8 years old at this time. My parents, I'm assuming, got me a subscription to this magazine probably as a Christmas gift, because this was the third issue I remember getting, and I remember excitedly showing the cover to my mom. This was, to the best that I can recall, my very first exposure to caricature. The second of my two memories is also tied to Sports Illustrated for Kids. The magazine included in the opening pages of each issue art that kids had submitted each month. Sometimes this art consisted of big cartoon faces superimposed over tiny bodies, mimicking the style of the editorial illustrations in the magazine. And I, being young and impressionable and artistically minded, proceeded to copy this in my own artistic endeavors. So I feverishly drew professional athletes with big heads on tiny little bodies. And I actually still have, I don't have much work from when I was young, but I was able to find this. This is a 4-H project I did, I think as a clover bud. So my third memory is a classic Peanuts collection that I either found at a thrift store my grandma worked at or that she actually bought for me. And this was my introduction to Charlie Brown, Snoopy, and the work of Charles Schulz. It was also my introduction to the world of comic strips and cartoons in general. And this proved to have an immense amount of influence over my artistic development. First, I loved the comic strips for the pure enjoyment I got from reading them. The jokes, the humor, the funny drawings. Secondly, the style of art I saw in the comic strips dovetailed closely with the style of art I had already found so appealing. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, I think this was the first time it dawned on me that I could potentially make a living drawing funny faces. Previously, I'd been an aspiring NFL football player, before that an Army man, and even before that, and I promise you I'm not making this up, a garbage truck worker. But somewhere between the ages of 10 and 13, I decided I wanted to be a cartoonist. I spent the next several years devouring comic strips and also cranking out my own attempts at comic strips. Here are a few of those ill-fated attempts. I did end up actually submitting some to a syndicate, and I got a rejection letter, which I believe I kept, but I could not find it in time for this. Anyway, at around the age of 16, I gave up my dream of becoming a cartoonist, having realized my sense of humor just wasn't funny enough. My love for that style of drawing, however, never subsided. So those are some of my inspirations growing up. There proved to be one other life-changing inspiration in my life, however, which I discovered in college, and that is the work of an artist named Jason Siler. Up to that point, I was familiar with only a certain caliber of caricature art, some of the simpler editorial illustration you might see in magazines, or the type of caricature that might be done relatively quickly at the state fair, for example. And I think it's probably fair to say that this type of art is what most people think of when they think of caricature. Siler's work, he's done work for television shows, films, numerous national and international publications. He's been on the cover of Time magazine. And he elevates caricature to something that is truly beautiful. And I was mesmerized by it. And I also discovered that while he worked and still does work through traditional methods, drawing and painting, he did his commercial art digitally. And this was kind of my introduction to digital art during my college years. And I'd already sort of been dabbling in digital art. I'd been using my mouse and the paintbrush tool in Photoshop to painstakingly try to paint characters and portraits. Seeing Siler's work convinced me to plunk down the money to buy a Wacom tablet, which I did after graduating school in 2010. Since then, I have been creating mostly digital art. In the years since, I've discovered many absolutely tremendous illustrators and caricature artists, but Siler's work remains the best and most inspiring I've ever seen. All right, where does caricature come from? I just want to quickly touch on this because it's kind of a fascinating topic in its own right, but I'm going to do this basically just hitting on a few bullet points. Caricature has existed for literally thousands of years. Some trace the origin of caricature back even to the days of the Assyrians and Egyptians. A 1917 article in the Bulletin of the College Art Association of America notes that it is certain that the Greeks were not merely idealists and that caricature was very familiar to their art, and that the Romans carried on the practice of caricature and furnished them much pleasure in public and private. And this is actually a pretty famous example of caricature graffiti art on a wall in Pompeii. Also from the article, the Greeks and Romans had their funnies, and caricature was a well-known diversion of classical artists. As the ancients had no daily press or comic supplement, the channels of communication with the public were the open-air theaters, the decoration of vases, and other objects of everyday use. In the century since, artists such as Leonardo da Vinci and Claude Monet were known to dabble in caricature. Here's an example of some of Da Vinci's caricatures. And Monet actually started drawing caricatures as a teenager as a way to make money. And of course, we know him today more for his landscape painting, but he actually gained a certain amount of fame for his caricatures, which you can see here. The caricatures were increasingly employed during the 16th and 17th centuries to satire or ridicule politicians and other public figures. James Gillray, for example, and this is one of his works. It's actually considered to be the most famous political cartoon of all time. And he was a British caricature artist who lived from 1756 to 1815. He's been called the father of the political cartoon. He spent years lampooning Napoleon Bonaparte, who is pictured here, as well as King George III, among others. And his depiction of Napoleon is especially famous because he portrayed him as kind of this Yosemite Sam-style buffoon with this gigantic hat. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about my work the past decade or so. Some of the pieces I'm going to be talking about are in this gallery. There's other pieces that are not. For many of these, I was able to find the original main photo reference that I used. And I've included them side by side so you can see what I was going off of. I've organized these roughly in chronological order. So this first work I'm showing is actually from around 2009. So it was relatively early in my development as a digital artist and a caricature artist. It's not my finest technical work, but I'm including it for two reasons. First, this was sort of the moment where I felt an initial breakthrough, that I had completed a caricature and felt pretty good about it. This is also the first one that I took beyond sketch and digitally painted. I was doing it with just a regular mouse on a mouse pad, using the Photoshop brush tool and painting over a sketch that I had scanned in. So it was extremely painstaking and time intensive. In fact, I could not imagine doing that today. But I do consider this piece to be a milestone, and I look upon it quite fondly. The second reason I'm including this is it's a good opportunity to answer a question I get a lot. What makes me want to do a caricature of someone? There's basically only three reasons I do a caricature of someone. One, I'm getting paid for it, so there's money involved. Two, someone has an intriguing face that I feel the urge to draw. Or three, I have some connection or fondness for or interest in the person through pop culture or politics. Usually it's some combination of reasons 2 and 3. And Don Knotts as Barney Fife is the quintessential example of this. He is a caricature artist's dream. And I actually did end up drawing him again years later, and this one is part of the show tonight. I think it's back there. Don Knotts had just some hilarious bug-eyed expressions as well, and just tremendous display of expressions and emotions. And I actually do want to go back and do another caricature of him at some point, featuring just a surprise face where he's got his eyeballs bulging out of his sockets. This next one is Alan Quist, who I believe may still be a professor here at Bethany. I did this back in 2012 when he was running for Congress. This piece is personally significant to me. It was probably the 10th or 11th piece I did with the Wacom tablet I had purchased. It was definitely a learning curve, both in terms of trying to get better at caricature and also in terms of learning how to use this new drawing tablet I had. Every piece I did was an improvement over the previous one, but this one in particular felt a lot like a breakthrough for me. And this is also a good example of what I would term gentle caricature. There's exaggeration here, but it's all subtle. I don't necessarily like hitting people over the head with exaggeration, where it's obvious that you just gave somebody a big nose or big ears. That's kind of a cheap way of caricature. I just like doing enough sometimes where viewers know something is up, but not enough where it's immediately obvious what I've done to create the effect. And I think that's the case here. My goal with this piece was to emphasize the idea of wisdom and knowledge. Those are difficult concepts to pull off in a caricature, but I like the challenge. And going back to the definition of caricature I used at the beginning of this, it's one of the reasons why I take a little issue with a definition of caricature that implies it only involves exaggerating to comic or grotesque effect. That's what a lot of caricature is, but even here at the very beginning of my journey, I was drawn to trying to do something a little more nuanced. Now, does this have a slightly humorous feel to it? It does, but I think it's very subdued humor, more like twinkle in your eye humor as opposed to hit you over the head comedy. Okay, so this next thing is a series of characters I did for USA Network for one of their television shows called Psych. The thing I remember most about this project is I was in way over my head. I had absolutely no business doing a project like this, and frankly, it's a miracle that it came to fruition. The project started with this painting of Detective Lassiter, one of the characters on the show. I posted on Twitter late one afternoon, and this would have been late 2012, I think. I tagged the actor in the tweet on the offhand chance he would see it. He did, and he retweeted it. The next morning, the director of social media for USA Network reached out to me, and that's how this project was born. It was part of an all-night marathon of fan-favorite episodes leading up to the show's season premiere, and that's why you have the kind of the sleepover theme. Now, I was still working at the Fayetteville Daily News at the time, and I worked 3 in the afternoon to midnight, and then I spent all my free time in the mornings and early afternoons just working on my art. And as it turns out, this project really came down to the wire, in part to reasons that were beyond my control. And I vividly remember spending the Super Bowl that year all alone in my basement apartment, literally sitting in the dark, watching the game out of the corner of my eye as I frantically worked on finishing these. Now, this actual work is not what I would consider my best, in part because of the rush, in part because of my own relative inexperience, and in part due to having to work off some poor reference photos. I did conduct some improvised photo shoots for these, where a couple nights after work while at the Daily News office, I had 2 of my colleagues, Brendan and Josh, pose with pillows and sleeping blankets so that I had at least some accurate reference for what that would look like. If you look closely, you can see there's a big difference between the quality of the illustration showing the sleeping bag and the pillow versus the guy with the pineapples in the paper bag. And I actually don't know if you can see the difference on this projector screen, but trust me, if you saw the actual pieces, you'd see the difference. So the moral of the story is that if you're doing something more complex like this, getting good photo references is a must. More on this later. The other thing is that while I think these characters are fine from a technical standpoint, looking back now, I think some of them lack that spark, that emotion. The 2 best characters are Gus on the top left and then the original Lassiter on the top right, just because they show more personality. Gus has this kind of ever so slightly disgusted, "Are you kidding me?" look, and then Lassiter just has this delightful sneer on his face. And I think they stand out more because of that. Having said that, part of the issue here is that some people were sensitive about their portrayals, and so I couldn't caricature them as vigorously as I might have done if left to my own devices. So these debuted as part of an app on the night of the TV marathon. The idea is that you could collect all the stickers online and then get the swag, including the physical stickers, sent to you. So this is a picture of the actual stickers. This is Anthony Melchiori. He was the host of a Travel Channel TV show called Hotel Impossible. I'm including this one because it's a good, clean example of picking out features to exaggerate, and just as importantly, the relationship between features. Now this is almost cheating because this guy has just such a distinctive face. But you can see how I approach this caricature. He has more mass on the top half of his face than the bottom. I should move ahead here. He has a wide forehead versus a short chin. His ears are big, his nose is long, at least within the context of his overall face, which is more squat. So those are the obvious elements to exaggerate. Now, one of the tricks of caricature is that you can't exaggerate everything. Otherwise, you end up with a mess. Some features you need to either let exist as is or even slightly de-emphasize and let fade into the background. There's a good example here in that his lips and mouth are also quite prominent on his face. But there's already so much going on that I decided not to make that an emphasis with this particular painting. And his eyes aren't necessarily small, but I purposely made them smaller within the caricature. This is a good example of what I talk about when referring to the relationship of features. There's always a push and pull, so whenever you're exaggerating one feature, it usually means you need to diminish another feature. This is a guy named Brian Jakes, I believe. He was my favorite author growing up. I like this caricature because it's a good example of capturing a likeness in the emotional sense. I did dial his personality up here, not just based on the photo, but because in person he was very jovial and outgoing. I think this speaks to why I enjoy doing caricatures of people or characters I'm familiar with, and why those characters turn out better, because I have more familiarity with the subject. I have more cues to go on than just the photo. Sometimes I do commission caricatures for random people, and those can prove to be a little more difficult just because it's more personal. You're just working off of a photo of someone you don't actually know, and so that can prove to be a challenge. The other notable thing about this piece is that I think this is another example of a caricature that's effective because of what I'm choosing to minimize. Now, did I exaggerate and make more cartoony a few things? Sure. His chin's bigger, but it's not that much bigger. And his nose isn't really that exaggerated either, certainly not as exaggerated as I could have made it. Instead, I exaggerated his forehead by making it shorter and playing with its shape, and I also made his eyes smaller. This has the effect of making his smile seem even bigger. I also exaggerated his expression by giving more prominence to his wrinkles and the bags under his eyes. The overall effect is one of joy and laughter that I think better displays his personality than the original headshot. All right, so some of you may have seen these illustrations around town if you live in the area. This whole thing started because the then owner of the company had a Ducks costume he wanted to use in parades that summer, and he wanted to continue the theme in the company's other collateral. The ideas he had in mind couldn't really be executed through photo shoots or Photoshop, at least not with a budget that would have been feasible. And so that's where the idea of doing this as an illustration came into being. Originally, there was only going to be a series of 4 illustrations. This project ended up taking on a life of its own, and when all was said and done, I did somewhere around 8 or 9 illustrations for them. That one is in the show back there, I believe. Some of these ended up being a little more cartoony than my normal style. That was due to time and budget limitations. I do remember the photo shoot for this one because I was the one that had to simulate hanging from the gutters. So those are my hands, arms, and t-shirt in that illustration. The face is from a stock photo image that we photoshopped onto my head. This is actress Maggie Lawson. This one is unusual in that I started around 2012 or 2013, got frustrated and let it sit. Yeah, I couldn't quite capture the likeness at the time. It wasn't until 3 or 4 years later that I decided to revisit it and finish it, and I'm really happy I did. My favorite part is the eyes. I try to spend quite a bit of time making sure I have the eyes right, because you can add a lot of emotional punch to a caricature through the correct portrayal of the eyes. This is my friend Joel Hanson. This is another example of a piece where it was helpful to know someone personally and use that to inform the caricature and capture the essence of his personality. I don't think Joel was able to make it tonight, but I told him I was going to show this. And he's got an interesting face, prominent nose, prominent eyebrows, a huge smile. And so everything else, the forehead, the eyes, ears, chin, even the cheeks, I basically minimized to make room for what I wanted to exaggerate. So Christopher Walken. I think one of the reasons why it's a challenge for me to talk about my own work is that usually I complete a piece, and by the time I'm done with it, I've stopped being impressed by it. I'll look back at various pieces of work and think, it's okay. I almost get bored by them sometimes. This piece is actually an exception to the rule. I think it stands the test of time, and it is to this day probably one of the 3 or 4 favorite characters I've ever done. I do remember that this piece was a huge struggle though. I sketched a lot of variations trying to figure out what I wanted to do, because there's a lot of different ways to tackle someone like Christopher Walken. And one of the issues is that Walken's appearance can vary quite a bit based on the angle of a given photo. For example, in this photo, he appears to have a relatively short forehead and a long cheek and jawline below. But in other photos, his forehead appears quite long. And in this photo, his nose appears to be relatively long, but in other photos, his nose looks shorter, at least within the context of his face. So that was my challenge in tackling this one. And I basically ended up exaggerating this in a way that doesn't really line up with this precise reference photo here. I decided to exaggerate based on how I thought Walken's features looked based off of a variety of photos. And this is one of the things I learned from Jason Siler. Try not to just use one photo of a subject as a reference, because a single photo can lie. Angles and shadows can mess with features and make them look different than how they might otherwise appear at other angles or in different lighting. I ended up deciding that the defining feature of Walken are, first of all, his eyes, because he has this very unnerving stare. And his lips are also, and I don't quite know how else to put this, kind of creepy. It's what has made him such an effective movie villain over the years. You can see that I really emphasize his eyes and his stare here, and I think that was the right decision. I'm going to talk briefly about 2 portraits here. This first is one I did of Douglas MacArthur, and this one, I actually tried to treat it as more than just a portrait. I wanted to give it a movie poster feel and make it feel very painterly. Why the red? Well, first, red is about as bold and threatening a color you can go with, and I wanted this to feel bold and stand out. The red also works in the context of a subject matter that deals with war and bloodshed. And it also works in the context of MacArthur fought in the Pacific Theater against Japan, whose flag has the red dot, i.e. the rising sun. And finally, I thought it would be interesting just to see what would happen if I worked in grayscale against a solid color like red. I was really happy with these results. I have not yet done other pieces like this, but in the future, I would like to revisit this idea. This is a commissioned portrait I did of my friend Lene. Over the years, I've discovered that my work sometimes tends to blur the boundaries that exist between caricature and realism. Some of my characters are very lifelike, and my portraits have become more stylized and illustrative. And that's an underrated beauty to the art of caricature, because it takes you out of the mindset of simply copying what you see with your eye, and it puts you in the mindset of figuring out how you can put your own twist on what you're looking at. The other aspect of this is that there is a lot of digital art that looks digital. It looks kind of just plastic, I would describe it. And I do try to avoid having my work appear overtly digital. I like my work to have a painterly, tangible feel to it. I also like to surprise people with my work. I don't like being predictable. I did this piece, this is Pennywise the Clown, because there's something so viscerally unsettling about his face. And I thought it would be a fun experience to see what happened if I tried to caricature a face that is, for all intents and purposes, already this creepy caricature. And I had a lot of fun doing this. I get a kick out of seeing or hearing people's reactions when they see it. I have an up close on part of this just so that you can fully appreciate it in all its beauty. By the time I did this piece, I had started experimenting with adding a slight Photoshop effect, just adding in a filter with some noise. So in other words, adding just this very subtle, grainy effect. This was a trick I learned from watching some of Jason Siler's videos. Because he does that to help tie the piece together, it makes it feel a little more tactile and just gives it a slightly warm feel. It gives it more character. And I'm actually gonna, this is not my notes, but I realized this after I printed this off. So you might ask, well, how do you caricature something that's already a caricature? And you can do it in really subtle ways. And one of the ways I did it here is making the pupils in his eyes smaller than they actually are. And so, because by making the pupils smaller, you're subtly creating the effect of something that's sinister or evil, versus the larger that you make the pupils, the more acute something appears. And of course, the obvious opposite of this would be babies, because they have such large eyes. So here's an example where I don't think people would ever think of that, but I made the pupils smaller because it's a very slight way of exaggerating an effect I'm already trying to accomplish. I'm going to use this piece to talk briefly about my process. I don't go through this exact process for every single piece of work I do, but this is reflective of what I do for something that's more in depth. So this is Gary Johnson. This is what I'm working with, the Walken Cintiq. You have a pen, you can draw right on the screen. I work in Photoshop using the paintbrush tool. Usually my screen is not as clutter-free as this particular image, unfortunately. So for this one, I had a general idea of what I wanted to do. I wanted to do something with Gary Johnson, who was the 2016 Libertarian presidential candidate. I looked for various photo references that I thought might work and did some sketching. I actually liked the sketch on the far right the best, but for the purposes of what I was trying to do, I ended up going with the center left sketch. Then I gathered photo references for the rest of the illustration. This included getting photos of myself posing in the pose I needed with the lighting that would generally match what I needed. Then I put together a black and white sketch, and this sketch is actually more detailed than what I might normally do. I don't have much for in-progress steps, but I was able to find this one and compare it side by side to the finished one, which is on the right. You can see that relatively late in the game, I adjusted the colors quite a bit because I was trending to yellow-green. Normally that's a correction I should have caught early in the process, but sometimes you get caught up in the details and miss the big picture. You can also see the difference in hair detail here. Hair is one of the most difficult things for me to draw, and so I usually save it for late in the process. And there's the finished piece. So I have a few other examples of sketches and basically unfinished work that's been sitting around, in some cases for years. And I just thought it'd be fun to go through these quickly. This is chess champion Bobby Fischer, and you can see on the right-hand corner there that when I'm starting a piece, I basically have the equivalent of a little color palette at the bottom that I refer to. I really try to avoid just eye-dropping from the actual reference photo, because I do feel like that's cheating, and you sort of tend to lose the painterly effect. So here's a bunch of other rough sketches. That is George the Animal Steele in the top left, Princess Leia on the bottom left, Megyn Kelly in the center, and then the honky-tonk man on the right. He was a former professional wrestler. The Princess Leia one, I actually started that when she died, and I really want to finish it. I don't know if I'll ever get around to it. I don't quite have the likeness right. Here's some more sketches. Penelope Cruz on the top left, Gomer Pyle on the bottom left. Then there's some characters from Hogan's Heroes, Brock Lesnar on the bottom right, and then Sean Hannity on the top right. There's actually a little bit of a funny story behind the Hannity sketch. I doodled this in 2016 during the Republican primary. And I don't know if you know who Sean is, but he's a big name on Fox News, and he has a radio show and a TV show, and he was a big booster for President Trump back then. And I don't know if you can tell this, but there's a little teardrop that I have coming down the right eye there. And if I remember correctly, my idea at the time was to show Hannity in this little cheerleader outfit with pom-poms and everything, and this would show him crying on election night after Trump lost. And lo and behold, I was the one in for a surprise on election night. So it's probably a good thing I did not spend more time fleshing this one out. And speaking of the Trumps, I have, that's an unfinished one of Melania Trump on the right, but it's relatively close to being finished. And then I have two examples of unfinished characters on the left, including Trump. I don't know if I will ever actually get around to finishing it. I used to feel obligated to finish a piece. So if I started as a sketch, come hell or high water, I was going to finish it. I don't feel that way anymore now. I've grown to appreciate the raw, unfinished state of sketches more, and it's less stressful when you learn to accept that you can just sketch and leave things unfinished. I'm just going to run through a few examples of other work I've done for clients. This was a collage commission for the Massage family. They run Olives and the massage restaurants. I really liked what I was able to do with the colors for this one. I gave it a very painterly feel, and I had a lot of fun just coming up with the collage and arranging it in a way that I thought would work well. This was for a Minnesota news and sports podcast. I enjoyed this one because I got to spoof Star Wars. This was an illustration for Snippered Homes out of Sleepy Eye. I had to keep this loose because it was a very quick turnaround. I only had a few days to do it. And this last one is a little character illustration I drew for Water Doctors, which is a company up in the Twin Cities. All right, so I'm going to close with a few final slides showing some of my Johnny Cash work over the years. So not only are these in chronological order in terms of when I drew them, they're also in chronological order in terms of his age. And I'm closing with these couple of pieces because I think they also show my progression as an artist. So his first depiction of him was when he was his youngest. The focus of this piece isn't even really Cash, rather it's his environment and the relationship between light and shadows. The face is probably a little more cartoony than what I do now, but I still like the feel of the microphone and his hands and the way the shadows work on them. Each of these first two has a very introspective, almost sad quality to it. And his music, especially at the very end of his life, has had a big impact on me over the years. And that's, I think, one reason why I've enjoyed drawing Cash so much. The second one is probably the strongest of the four from a technical standpoint. I really like the mix between caricature and realism and between polish and roughness. I went with very rough brush strokes for the bottom and tried to replicate the feel of canvas. You can start to tell at this point as an artist that I was becoming more preoccupied with making certain pieces feel as emotionally raw as possible. Basically, I was looking for grit. This third Cash piece, I was trying to capture a dead look in his eyes, something very depressing, very defeated, just weary. Cash battled alcohol and drug problems throughout his career, and at this point later in his life, you can see the toll life has started to take. Basically, everything in this caricature, the hair, forehead, nose, mouth, was only of a secondary concern to me here. What really mattered was getting that space from the eyebrows down to the bags underneath his eyes just right. Again, character tends to be associated with happy, funny images, big smiles, big teeth, big noses. The more I've gotten into caricature, the more I like to subvert that and purposely caricature things that are maybe unsettling or dark or brooding or depressing. I also like, I'm gonna go back here, I don't know if you can see this, there's a dash of red toward the bottom. And it's kind of random, but I liked it because it added to the rough feel. It adds an element of warning or danger, maybe slightly hints at the idea of approaching death and decay. This last one, I'm really blurring the lines here between caricature and portrait. This is one of the last photos, maybe even the last, although I'd have to double check, that was taken of Cash. There is some caricature, but it's not intended for comic effect at all. Instead, it's there to emphasize this mix of loneliness, sadness, and bravery. Everything is rough and raw. And really, some of these last works I've talked about, the Walken caricature, the Pennywise caricature, these Cash pieces, are probably more reflective of where my journey as an artist has taken me and where I hope to go in the future. I've always made it my goal to try to elevate the art of caricature and break people's, well, not break, maybe at least challenge people's conceptions of what caricature as an art form is. And increasingly these days, I find myself intrigued by the idea of using this art form to face themes that we never normally associate with caricature. Themes of loneliness or fear or sadness or regret or even age and death. And that's kind of a depressing note to end on, but I'm intentionally choosing to wrap it up with that particular thought. Hopefully I've been able to shed some light on the nature of caricature, the nature of my work, and do it in a provocative and interesting way. And before I go, I also need to thank a few people without whom this show would not have been possible. And I'm not just saying that, I really mean it. First, I'd like to thank Bethany and Professor Bukowski for the opportunity to put on this show here and speak to you about my work. I'd like to thank my parents and my girlfriend Carissa, and also Dave Cruz, who are all out in the crowd somewhere. Thank you for your help in putting this show together. I'd also like to thank Wes Taylor, who also provided invaluable insight. And I appreciate everything everyone did so much. And thank you all who showed up this evening to hear me talk face to face. Thank you. I guess I'm supposed to take questions. So anyone has questions, let me know. Yes.
Yeah, the thing I'm struck by most in each portrait is the use of light and shade. A lot of times, I've seen now compared to the images where I've come, the lighting is better in the portrait than it is in the original image. I'm wondering, do you have sort of a library of light and shadow in your mind that is coming out of you, or how are you making that happen?
Well, I think that's the formal art training in me, because for years and years I like to draw portraits and try to just draw things that were as lifelike as possible. And there's immense value in that. And so when you move over to caricature and you don't just lose all that, instead you take everything you've learned and then you start applying it to caricature. And so yeah, that's very deliberate. When you're talking about exaggerating, it's not just noses or ears or whatnot. It can be really subtle things, including pupils of eyes, and including lighting and shadow. Those are things that you can exaggerate to help with the effect. And actually, it's kind of funny because going through this and preparing for this, I started looking at some of my older work more carefully. And even some of the stuff here that I showed, I saw stuff where I was like, if I were doing that now, I'd make the lighting on this better. So there's even stuff I see in my own work from a few years ago where I think, I could have done better here.
I'd like to second that question.
Maybe I should let Ty get up here. He could answer that question for me. If I'm giving an accurate answer, I think the truth is that I'm busy enough these days with work that my focus on any given day or any given week tends to be just getting through that particular day and that particular week. And so that is one of the big struggles in my life right now. If you're the people who are in college right now, I just like to encourage you to really take advantage of the freedom you have, because when you get out in the real world, and I don't want to make it sound dark and dreary, because it's not, it's very rewarding, but it can also become a grind. And I don't think you truly appreciate that when you're in college. And then once you're out, that you think, man, I really should have taken better advantage of that. But that is one of my struggles, is trying to figure out a better balance and how can I meet my day-to-day and week-to-week responsibilities while still work toward a long-term goal.
Could you break down how much was commission and how much is personal work?
Well, in the past, the vast majority was personal work. And now these days, because I've gotten busier with design and everything, I don't have as much free time. The work that I do tends to be more commissioned.
So what made you do Carl, or how did that come about? And can you talk a little bit about that, please?
I don't know if I remember much about this piece. I do know I've done some Vikings illustrations in the past for the MSU Reporter. They always have this special training camp issue. And I do like history, and I like incorporating history into my work, and I also love the Vikings and sports. And so it seemed like a good match. And for this particular image, it's just such a striking image, and I thought it was something that I could really play up. And so if you look closely at the image, you can see it's parts of it that are very rough, and I don't know if that answered your question. It was basically just it was, again, the appeal of the image itself that I thought was intriguing, and then my interest in the Vikings and history. Oh, I have to decide here. I think we'll go with you first.
I might have two questions. I'll save one till after Bill goes. I'm wondering about. It seems as though you stumbled upon a medium with the tablet thing and with the digital painting that you're doing and everything. When I often think of caricature artists, I think of people at festivals or mall or there's people you can sit down and hand them a 5 or a 10 and they'll do you and your buddies or whatever. And did you ever do that? Did you ever start that way, or what? Or do you ever use pencil and paper anymore? I guess I'm interested in the dichotomy really of the mediums of maybe pencil and paper and drawing and then the digital.
Sure. I still do use a pencil and paper. It tends to be more just for sketching. I don't do much finished work. And even though I enjoy working digitally, long term I would like to get back more into even something like watercolor painting, because I used to do that when I was in school, and now it's one of those things where it's difficult to find the time for. But I'd like to get back into that. As for the caricature artists who work, fairs and festivals, I was interested in that, and that's really what I knew caricature as being. But then I discovered Jason Siler's work and what he was doing for editorial illustration, and that just blew me away. And from the moment I saw his work, I knew this is what I'd rather be doing. That is, people who work at festivals and fairs, that is high pressure. That takes a definite skill set, which I don't think I even have, because it requires you to work very quickly and make decisions very quickly, and they need to be the right decisions, otherwise your customers can be unhappy, right? So I don't know if I could quite deal working in that kind of environment. I think that'd be very stressful for me.
I guess mine's not artistic, but more business. So when you're doing your work, how much do you rely on Mankato, the region, Minneapolis, or national for your work?
Some of it has been local. I think and there were projects that got exposure that led to other people reaching out to me, and then I do private commissions for them. I'd say it's been a fair mix. Yes, all of the above. I don't know if I even want to call any time.
Could you just explain to everyone what you do to make your bread and butter today?
Yeah, I'm a freelance graphic designer and illustrator. The bulk of my work is graphic design, and that's when I talk about getting busy with life and work. It's because the graphic design work has picked up so much.
Which one do you enjoy more?
Well, it depends on the individual project, to be quite honest. There's illustrated stuff I've had to do where I think, I don't quite love what I'm doing, but that's the way it is with a lot of graphic design work too, right? And so I take it project by project. Well, the freelance refers to me being self-employed and just Yeah, so the freelance is more of the nature of my job status. Graphic design is more of, logos, branding, designing collateral, business cards, websites.
If computers are the native medium, where these things begin, and we see them on the walls, does the printing ever translate wrong? You look at the prints and are you dissatisfied with that output?
So that is an interesting question, because I actually have not dealt with that much. And so it was in the preparation for the show. I think that the preparation for the show was one of the first times where I ever had to seriously grapple with that. And I mean, I do know I think I was generally satisfied with the way things printed. There were one or two where I was like, that looks it pops more on the screen. So there are some elements that you could lose in the translation to print. I haven't had the chance to deal with that question much, for better or worse.
I have a question for Linda on that same line. I'm wondering if you ever printed on aluminum, where it seems like it really pops when you print on a different substrate. And then the other question was, like this portrait you did over here of the south. Have you ever painted a picture of where portraits are not much character, but just commissioned artwork or painting?
The answer to the second question is yes. I've just done commissioned portraits of entire families together. The answer to the first question, no, I can't remember having printed on anything unusual like aluminum.
I'd like to just ask about, first of all, I have to apologize for my ignorance, but I remember I have such a limited knowledge of Photoshop. Photoshop is what you mainly use, is that what you were mentioning?
Yes.
Okay, so when I was first introduced, like in the 90s, I was first introduced to Photoshop, and it was a picture of my head, and then I could make the eyeballs small, and make one of my eyeballs really big, and I just did this weird goofball thing with my face, and it was just little things that the computer did for me. And so you had mentioned just tonight about you didn't want to cheat, so you were using your own color palette. What else in Photoshop would you not do? Or are you resizing things using Photoshop tools? And I don't know anything about it, and so I'm just wondering, and at what point would you, I just thought it interesting that you said you thought some things were cheating. Can you elaborate on what you think is and what you think isn't?
Yeah, well, I mean, I should preface this by saying that, what my definition of what cheating may or may not be might not line up with what another artist's definition of cheating might or might not be. And actually, there are artists who specialize in photo exaggeration. I mean, so they'll take existing photographs and they'll do all this stuff to them in Photoshop, and essentially they'll crank out a caricature, but it's based off of an actual photo. And there's one artist in particular who's known for that, and I cannot remember his name, but yeah. So there's all sorts of rabbit holes. I think even though I work in Photoshop, I try to keep it as basic as possible. So for basically everything that's done here, I literally just use the paintbrush and then my pen. And there are a couple of different brushes I'll use, and so there might be a brush that gives me a little bit more of that canvas effect. But beyond that, for example, I would not, if there's an issue with color or shadow, I would not go into the curves and start trying to mess around and fix it that way. I'm not even saying there'd be anything wrong if I did do it that way. It's just, I think, a matter of personal preference.
I'm not sure if I know what that means, but that's
Okay. Yeah, I mean, when I'm starting, I'm basically starting with something like this. I just, white background, and then I have my, my brush tool set to a fine point and some gray opacity, and I just start sketching on the screen. And then when I have the sketch to a point where I'm happy with, I'll keep the sketch on one layer, and then I'll start working on a layer below or above it and just painting in the, blocking in colors and shadows and light and that kind of thing, and just build from there. I think Wes had his hand up first.
Tell them how long it takes for something like Christopher Walken.
I was thinking someone's going to ask me that question. I never have a good answer for this question because I'm not very good at logging my hours for my artwork. It varies so much. I could probably, if something's simpler, I could crank it out in probably 10 hours.
Take a guess at Christopher Walken.
Christopher Walken, honest to goodness, that may have been 40 to 60 hours. I spent a lot of time. I don't even know if that's the Christopher Walken one was unusual because I remember struggling a lot with sketches and messing around, and it was a very difficult character for me to tackle. It took a while though. Some of these do take a while.
So is any of this for sale?
Well, I guess there's a price sheet in the back.
Oh, good. Glad to hear it.
I'm wondering, do you ever run into copyright issues? If the photos you choose to work from, they're owned by somebody perhaps, or how do you find resources for your?
Well, I think the copyright issues that I would most run into is if I were trying to sell some of these on merchandise, like put them on mugs or T-shirts, because I think I might be running into issues there. Not even so much based off the photo that I'm using, but because I'd be trying to use the likeness of a celebrity to make money for myself. So I do know that's where maybe it's a disadvantage of some of the caricature art where it may not be as easy to monetize it through selling it on T-shirts or mugs or things like that. Any other questions?
I looked at these half-finished pieces. What's the pieces you put a lot of effort and time to that you didn't finish? Why?
I mean, normally if I put a lot of time or effort into them, I do try to finish them. I mean, that Trump one is probably the one I've put them. It's probably the of all the unfinished pieces I have right now, the Donald Trump one may be the one that I've put the most time into, and I may not finish it. I started back in 2016, and I don't know, I was running into problems with the hair. I really hate having to draw hair. And of course for Trump, hair is an important part of the face. And then now I'm just at the point where I'm kind of bored with the whole thing. So I don't know if I'll ever finish it. This might be the one though.
Do you have a website?
DerekWehrwein.com. Yeah, I would. I mean, I used to do quite a bit of painting, watercolor and acrylic and even some oil. And if I got to a point where I felt like I had more free time or could make more of a dedicated effort to doing that, I would. I think, some of these artists that I admire, and of course I keep bringing Jason Siler up, but he works digitally because it's what allows him to work most efficiently and most conveniently for the editorial jobs he does, because they require such fast turnarounds. But I mean, he still works. He does a lot of characters where it's just oil on canvas, and yeah, I'd definitely like to do that someday as well. I use Illustrator, but more for my graphic design. Literally, the only thing I've ever used for any of my digital paintings is, well, I take that back. In college, I did do a few editorial illustrations that were in Illustrator, but for my caricature and portrait work, yeah, I just work exclusively in Photoshop.
So, like Trump and like the Trumps here, like, so you weren't commissioned by them to do this. So when you're making them, I'm guessing it's like, you're kind of inspired by just the climate and everything. Like, what would be the ultimate intention with, would it be just to put them out there and share them, or just for personal interest, or like, and I'm guessing each one is a little different. Maybe there's different motivations, but like with this, I guess since you have it up, like what would be some of the examples of what you would intend to do with these?
Well, I don't know that I necessarily intend to do anything with these, because some of these have been sitting in my files for years now, and sometimes, I mean, I'm showing them here tonight because I thought it would be interesting, but like I said, I used to think, man, if I start a sketch of somebody, I need to finish it, and then I need to be able to share it with the public, and if I'm going to start it, I'm going to finish it. And at a certain point, I stopped feeling that way. So I'm okay with doing sketches just for my own enjoyment, and if no one else ever sees them, that's the way it is. And I don't know, does that answer your question?
No.
Okay. Well, run it by me again, I'll try again.
Well, yeah, no, well, it half answers it, but like, so like the Trumps, so those are, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, as like somebody who doesn't do this, they look close to finished. So, like, what would you do with those once you have considered them finished? Would you just keep them for yourself? Would you share them? Like, what would
the Trump one I'd probably share on Facebook just to see what kind of reactions I got, pro or con. That would be the real enjoyment there, is the reactions of people responding positively or negatively to the caricature of Trump.
But there's no like business marketing strategy that you've hired people.
Well, I mean, in the past I have. There have been times where I've done caricatures of people or things with the idea of, oh, I could tag them on Twitter and they might see it, but that was kind of back 2011, 2012, 2013. I'm sort of at a point now in my life where I'm not as concerned about that. All right, last question, you, Dave.
Aside from the esteemed halls of Bethany, where would you like, what's the goal, what would you like to go to, where would you like to see it go?
It'd be fun to make the cover of a political magazine or a news magazine.
You have the Trumps, just throwing it out there.
You seem really dialed in on the Trumps here.